In Jerusalem, a fragment of parchment describes 4 chambers beneath the earth.
Come, Enoch. Behind this mountain open 4 sealed chambers.
I committed no great sins. I rest in the light, but this is not the end. I seek no vengeance. I only wait for my case to be heard. I paid my debt while alive. Now I remain here, alone, in the gloom. I did not kill. I protected the one who did. And here I remain forever. Raphael, tell me, why does this last chamber never open?
In a sealed case at the shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, a parchment fragment the size of a playing card rests inside. 6 lines of Aramaic describe a place beneath the earth with 4 chambers, 4 populations, and 4 distinct conditions. None of those 4 conditions resemble what any Western church has referred to as hell for centuries. The Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible by the Council of Laodicea in the year 364 of our era and subsequently banned. For 17 centuries, the church labeled it dangerous and ordered that no one should copy those words again. However, in 1947, when the Dead Sea Scrolls came to light, 11 distinct copies of the same Book of Enoch appeared. These were more copies than those found of most of the books that still appear in your modern Bible today. And what those copies describe is not a single place of fire and punishment where all sinners go equally. To understand what it truly asserts, one must start with the hands that copied it and those who later hid it away. Enoch describes a structured system of 4 chambers, each with a category of person and entirely its own rules. Enoch's criteria for deciding who enters each chamber differ from what the church ultimately taught. In the next few minutes, you will see exactly what each of the 4 chambers described by this ancient text contains. You will see what specific actions send a person to each cavity and why all of this disappeared from Christian scripture. Hold onto that question, because each chamber we open will answer it with another piece of this ancient puzzle. The main narrative appears in chapter 22, within the section that scholars refer to as the Book of the Watchers. The Book of the Watchers recounts the fall of certain angels, and within that same narrative lies the map of the dead. Fragment 4, Q206. Housed in the Israel Museum, preserves the Aramaic text of that chapter, dated to around 100 BC. This makes it older than any of the books that today comprise the Christian New Testament that we all know. The complete version survives in Ge'ez manuscripts, safeguarded by the Ethiopian Orthodox monastery in the city of Axum. The specialist George Nicholsberg published in 2001 the reference commentary on First Enoch for Fortress Press. He defined chapter 22 as the most detailed depiction of the afterlife in any Second Temple Jewish text. His commentary remains, more than 20 years later, the definitive academic reference on First Enoch. Second Temple refers to nothing less than the religious tradition in which Jesus of Nazareth himself grew and was formed. It is the tradition that shaped what the first Christians came to believe about death, judgment, and what comes after. Chapter 22 of Enoch was part of that world. It was known, it was cited, and only later was it set aside and silenced. James van der Kam of Notre Dame, a leading expert on the scrolls, studied this ancient problem in great depth. He wrote that Enoch's scheme of the afterlife was almost certainly familiar to the authors of the New Testament themselves. What they inherited and chose to leave unsaid is rarely discussed openly in academia. What the early writers took from Enoch and then hushed up continues to pulse discreetly between the lines of the canon. The fragment containing chapter 22 deserves yet another layer of attention before we open its sealed chambers. 4Q206 is not the only material from Qumran that touches on the structure of the 4 underground cavities described by Enoch. Scholars of the Enochic corpus have identified related material in fragments 4Q204 and 4Q208, also found there. These fragments appear to offer varied descriptions of the same 4-chamber system, each with its own nuances. Lorenz Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University is the leading authority on the Aramaic tradition of Enoch today. His work on the Book of Giants connects Enoch with an entire library of texts that are now almost completely forgotten. In a 2015 article, he noted that the Qumran fragments reveal various traditions of scribes using that same framework. That is to say, the 4 cavities were not the strange idea of a single isolated author, but a shared and transmitted scheme. Several communities, several scribes, and several copies all preserve the same basic structure of Enoch's underworld. The 4 cavities were not a marginal teaching. They were the model of the afterlife accepted by Second Temple Judaism. This was what existed before the church councils began to cut away what they found uncomfortable. What the Council of Laodicea eliminated in the year 364 was not a marginal text or a rarity. It was the mainstream. And what replaced it? A simpler afterlife, less structured and much easier to manage by the institution. That simple version was the true innovation. The original, with its exact 4 chambers, is what came first. The original lingers in fragments within the Ge'ez manuscripts, waiting for someone to read it completely. This is not speculation, nor a modern reinterpretation. It is simply what the ancient text declares for itself. Written in Aramaic and older than the New Testament, it's preserved in one of the world's most guarded collections. The problem was never the translation. The problem is what the translation ends up saying when you follow it to the end. The text begins like this. The angel Raphael leads Enoch to a mountain located in the far west of the known world. Behind the mountain opens a place that he describes as vast, dark, and divided into separate sections from one another. It is not a single space, but 4 distinct cavities, each completely sealed off from the other cavities. The Ge'ez manuscript from Axum uses for cavity a word that the monks themselves also use to name a cistern. A cistern is a deep container built to hold something concrete and sealed to prevent any mixing. The 4 cavities are not connected. What inhabits one can never reach what inhabits another. That separation matters, because what Enoch finds inside each cavity is radically different from everything else. And the reason why each person is in their specific cavity is specific, never general or interchangeable with another. But the text does not stop there, and the first cavity is precisely the one that demands the most careful attention of all. Enoch describes it as the realm of righteous spirits, and it's crucial to clarify that term thoroughly. He does not speak of the perfect nor of the saints, but of the righteous people who lived a decent and ordinary life. Individuals who died without having committed great sins rest in that first underground and sealed cavity. The Ge'ez text describes their state as rest under a spring of luminous water that flows continuously over them. It is neither paradise nor a definitive reward. It is merely rest and clarity, nothing more and nothing less than that. Rest and light, but not fullness. The righteous dwell in a waiting room, not yet in the home they will one day enter. The righteous await something. As the text reveals, they have not yet reached their ultimate destination. They are in a state of waiting, comfortably preserved until a judgment that has yet to occur. This is precisely the detail that the Western Church found most difficult to fit within its own doctrine. According to Enoch, the righteous dead are not yet in heaven. They await in a comfortable place, but clearly unfinished. This does not align with the Catholic purgatory, which implies a painful purification before finally reaching glory. The first cavity contains no suffering at all. It simply is not the end, because the end has not yet arrived. What follows in the second cavity is even stranger than what the modern mind usually imagines by itself. The second cavity contains the spirits of those who died as victims of the violence of other human beings. People murdered without justice, whose executioners never received any punishment for what they had done. And Enoch specifies about this cavity something that does not appear in any other known ancient text to this day. The spirits of the second cavity are not at rest, for the narrative states that they cry out without any rest at all. The Gaz uses a verb that in other parts of the manuscript describes the sound of water, flowing with enormous force. It is a constant and continuous sound, impossible to stop, that flows just like a stream that never dries up. The murdered dead produce a continuous sound in the second cavity, but they do not do so seeking any revenge. Notice the inversion here. The guilty are not punished, the innocent are kept safe until their truth is heard. The text is explicit about what those spirits cry out for, locked away inside the second cavity. They cry out for their case to be heard and for their deaths to be recorded in the divine accounting of heaven. Their condition in the second cavity, that restlessness and that continuous sound, is not resolved until judgment arrives. The detail of the continuous sound deserves much more attention than scholars have granted it thus far. The Jez word for the sound of the murdered dead is not the word that designates weeping or sobbing, nor is it the word used for a scream. It is the word that names the sound of water that cannot be stopped. A spring, a river, something that flows ceaselessly simply because its source has never been completely cut off. The dead of the second cavity are not in agony. They are in constant movement, just like a living current. Their sound is not one of pain. It is the sound of an unresolved claim pressing against what holds it back. The parallel text, Mashafa Berhan, employs here a very precise legal term, taken from the language of courts. It is the same term that Ethiopian scribes used for a formally presented complaint, but not yet judged. A presented complaint is not yet a sentence handed down, and between the two lies all the waiting of that cavity. The second cavity is not a place of suffering. It is a place of pending action, with the case still open. The sound is that open case making itself heard, insisting until someone listens to it and finally resolves it. And the text is explicit. That sound does not fade until judgment, not until God simply decides that matter. It fades only when the case is formally heard and the death is officially recorded within the register. The murdered do not seek revenge. They seek recognition. And until it comes, they cry out endlessly. And what sends a person to the second cavity is not their sin, but having been wronged without any remedy. The dead, who were wronged and never avenged, remain held in a specific place and in a precisely equal state. There they produce a precise sound, awaiting an accounting that has not even finished arriving yet. The analogy of the cistern that the Mashafa Berhan uses for the 4 cavities deserves careful consideration. A cistern is not a prison. It is a container built with a purpose, sealed to preserve its contents. It remains closed until what it holds becomes necessary again for the end that motivated its construction. The ancients described a system of custody, not a system of punishment, and that difference changes everything. Nothing stored is lost, nothing mixes, nothing is forgotten. Each content awaits intact the day that was designated. 4 distinct cisterns, 4 distinct contents, each sealed off from the others and in its own state. The afterlife of Enoch 22 is not a moral economy built on rewards and punishments distributed according to merit. It is a system of record built on specificity, where each case occupies its exact and absolutely own slot. Where you are after death is determined by the precise nature of what remained unresolved in your final moment. It is like a legal archive, each case filed separately, each condition maintained until the process that corresponds to it. In a human archive, a file can be misplaced. In this archive, according to Enoch, no case ever gets lost. That is why Jerome called it too precise, and that is not a minor detail within this long history of silences. A general hell defined by the Church always leaves room for mediation and also for human intercession. A structured system with specific criteria for each chamber leaves no free space at all. Where the Church saw a single abyss, Enoch had drawn 4 rooms, each with its key, its rule, and its condemnation. And then comes the 3rd cavity, where Enoch's narrative diverges more strongly from all Western doctrine. The 3rd cavity contains sinners, but not all sinners, rather very specific and concrete sinners. And that specification matters more than anything else within the entirety of chapter 22 of the Book of Enoch. The 3rd cavity is for those who committed sins and received their punishment during the course of their own life. These are those who paid their debt while alive, who suffered for what they did long before they came to die. These spirits are not at rest, but neither are they being actively punished within their cavity. The Ge'ez describes them as separated, apart from both the righteous and those who cry out continuously without ceasing. The Ethiopian manuscript defines their state with a very exact word, not entirely dark, but rather dim and shadowy. They are not in agony. Rather, they seem to indicate that the matter is settled, despite the record still remaining. They sinned, were punished in life, and the cavity holds what remained of them after finally settling that debt. And here is precisely what translators preferred to leave out when rendering the text into modern languages. The 4th cavity is the one that most resembles what Western Christianity has called hell for centuries on end. And the Ge'ez text is extremely precise regarding who is truly locked away inside that 4th cavity. The 4th cavity does not contain murderers in general, nor does it enclose liars, thieves, or adulterers just like that. The 4th cavity contains a single, very specific category of person, defined with enormous care by the text itself. These are those who sinned, faced no punishment in life, and chose to ally themselves with other sinners in the world. The Ge'ez uses a compound expression that literally means those who helped to keep evil going. It's not just about those who did wrong, but also those who actively protected and sustained others' wrongdoing in the world. Individuals whose actions made it possible for harm to continue long after it would have ceased. on its own. These spirits are in darkness, and the text specifies that their condition involves truly active suffering. The Ge'ez employs a word that in other parts of Enoch describes the sensation of heat without any visible flame. And unlike the other three, the fourth cavity is expressly described as a permanent and unending condition. The text uses for its permanence the same word that it uses for the immovable permanence of the very mountains. It is not until judgment, but rather something continuous, without an announced end, extending endlessly into darkness. The other three cavities await a judgment. The fourth, in contrast, already seems to be the definitive sentence itself. The third cavity also holds a detail that no popular account of Enoch's afterlife tends to include. The people of the third cavity are completely alone in that dimness, each one entirely separated from the others. They do not rest together like the righteous, nor do they cry out as the unavenged dead do when they mourn together. The sinners who have already paid in life remain isolated, each on their own, without any company or comfort. The Ge'ez uses for them a word that Ethiopian scribes reserved for grain scattered on bare ground. Individual, disconnected, present, but not grouped. It is not an added punishment, but rather a simple consequence. The debt was paid, and the account was settled, but settling a debt does not restore what that same debt damaged. The third cavity holds people whose accounts are closed, but whose ties with others have already been severed. They are settled in dimness, alone, and that solitude is exactly the shape their own consequence takes. Their dimness is not torment, it is distance. The exact distance that their actions opened between them and everyone else. It is the most psychologically specific passage of Enoch 22, and, at the same time, the least commented on by scholars. Not because it describes suffering, but because it describes a consequence that requires no ongoing divine action. Isolation simply is, just as the absence of something simply is, without the need for any executioner. The part that should not be possible is how much this resembles the findings of a truly recent scientific field. Dr. Sam Parnia from NYU Langone Medical Center has spent over 2 decades studying human cardiac arrest in depth. He investigates what patients report during that period when the heart stops and the brain ceases to be measured. His research, published in the journal Resuscitation in 2014, documents surprisingly consistent patterns. The experiences of distress almost never involve physical pain, but rather a sense of unresolved accounts. It's not punishment, but an uncertain adjustment, feeling held at a threshold, aware of something still unresolved. Enoch describes the restless spirits of the murdered dead crying out for their case to finally be heard. Parnia's research documents, in hundreds of independent accounts, that same awareness of open accounts. 2 sources separated by about 2,300 years describe the same phenomenon in functionally identical terms. None of those patients had read Enoch, and yet they described, unknowingly, the same inner architecture. In 2022, another study in the annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, also led by Parnia, went even further. It found that consciousness during clinical death was sometimes accompanied by awareness of the effects of one's own actions. It was not guilt that those patients described, but awareness of the consequences of what they had done to others. This fits the structure of Enoch's 4 cavities better than any Western idea of the afterlife. Not a single indifferent destination, but a structured accounting according to the precise nature of each act. It is not about proving the text with science, but noticing that two very distant paths point in the same direction. The suppression of this narrative begins at the Council of Laodicea in the year 364, which removed Enoch from the scriptures. The Council's act states as a reason descriptions of the afterlife that exceed what had been revealed. A hell with 4 chambers and specific criteria is harder to use as a threat than one without any distinction. Jerome, while working on the Latin Vulgate around the year 400, completely excluded the Book of Enoch from his canon. He wrote in his preface that the descriptions of the afterlife were too precise to be considered reliable. Too precise, not too vague. The precision, and not the ambiguity, was exactly what hindered him. Augustine, in the City of God around the year 415, argued that those detailed accounts should not circulate among the people. He contended that they would lead people to calculate their position instead of humbly fearing their God. He was not saying that Enoch was false. He was saying that a structured afterlife was much less useful for the institution. A general judgment that only the church could interpret proved much more manageable than a system with fixed criteria. 3 distinct authorities in 3 different centuries coincided in setting aside the same text for the very same reason. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, beyond the reach of Rome, kept the Book of Enoch within its canon all that time. When James Bruce brought 3G's manuscripts to Europe in 1773, the reaction of scholars was enormously revealing. The scholars at Oxford deemed the chapters of the afterlife structurally incompatible with the entire doctrine. They did not say they were false, but incompatible, and that carefully chosen word hides a whole silent confession. What troubled those scholars was not a lie, but a different order than the one their own church had erected. For centuries, Europe had read about Enoch without being able to read Enoch until those manuscripts crossed the sea. Now, here is where this whole story stops being ancient and becomes disturbingly current and very present. In 2018, a team from Hebrew University sought permission from the Israel Museum for a detailed analysis. They wanted to compare fragment 4Q206 alongside 3 other related fragments of Enoch, also found there, in Qumran. The goal was to compare the description of the 4 chambers with other Second Temple texts about the same afterlife. The museum approved access to 2 of the 4 fragments, but the other 2 were in the process of conservation. Conservation of 2 specific fragments, chosen from thousands, containing the most specific content about the afterlife. The comparative study was published in 2020, using only the 2 fragments that were available at that time. The researchers noted that the 2 inaccessible fragments would likely reinforce their own conclusions significantly. Those fragments remain in conservation, and no date has been set for their return to the study collection. It's notable that the most explicit fragments about the afterlife are the ones being withheld, at the very least. Thousands of fragments await in those collections, but just these 2, the most explicit, are not available. Now, let us be clear, so that no one distorts what is asserted here and also what is deliberately not asserted here. I am not saying that Enoch 22 is a literal blueprint of a physical underworld with 4 rooms beneath a real mountain. The narrative of Enoch traversed centuries of transmission and translation before reaching the manuscripts we can read today. What a Jewish writer experienced and what an Ethiopian monk copied 1,500 years later holds a great distance. It's a distance we can't fully measure, and it would be dishonest to claim we know it with complete accuracy. Honesty requires us to acknowledge our ignorance while also facing the truths that the text presents. But what the text describes, read carefully in the Aramaic fragments and in the Jer's manuscripts, is not vague at all. It is a structured system with specific criteria, so defined that they become almost uncomfortable to hold aloud. Rest for the righteous, currents awaiting judgment, and sound restlessness for the murdered who no one has avenged. Dim shadow for the sinner who has already paid their debt, and perpetual darkness for those who sustained evil in others. None of those four criteria align with what any Western church has been teaching for 1600 years. The Council of Laodicea removed this narrative in 364, and Jerome dismissed it as simply being too precise. Augustine called it incompatible with doctrine, and yet neither of them ever dared to declare it false. What we must now confront head-on is the fourth cavity, the most disturbing of all those that were described. Not the first, which offers comfort to the righteous currents waiting patiently for the arrival of final judgment. Not the second, which holds the unavenged in a continuous sound until their cause is finally heard completely. And not the third, where those who have already paid in life remain held in a dim and very solitary shadow. The criterion of the fourth cavity is what most clearly explains why the church found that passage dangerous. It is not the thief or the liar who most troubled the councils, but rather the one who turns evil into structure. A general hell for sinners is a threat that the institution can manage with relative ease. It is enough to preach against sin, offer absolution, and then gather back the penitents who return repentant. But a permanent cavity, reserved for those who sustained the evil of others, is a matter of a very different nature. These are the ones who shielded harm from its natural end and kept alive the evil that was already fading away. That category does not respond to absolution, because you cannot confess to escape from a purely structural role. You cannot be forgiven for a system that you yourself maintained if that system continues to function even today. The criterion of the fourth cavity hints at something truly uncomfortable for every major institution in human history. It suggests that the structures that protect the guilty from their consequences are in themselves a kind of sin. Not the evil itself, but its shield. Not the harm, but the protection that stops it from facing its rightful response. Jerome read this passage, and Augustine also read it, and neither of them claimed it was wrong. Both, however, agreed in labeling it dangerous, and that agreement says more than any possible refutation. The danger was not theological, but institutional, and that distinction is the secret key to this long silence. A church that read this passage attentively would be forced to ask itself what exactly it was protecting. The uncomfortable question is not whom the fourth cavity punishes, but whom it describes with truly unsettling accuracy. The fourth cavity, the only one Enoch describes as permanent, is not reserved for sinners in general. It is not for liars, nor for thieves, nor for those who lost faith at some point in their own life. It is specifically reserved for those who helped keep evil alive within the world of men. For those who allowed harm to persist and enabled evil to advance when it was already on the verge of stopping. That is the category that Enoch places in permanent darkness, with a heat that burns without ever showing any visible flame. Not the sin alone, but the sustained evil, the facilitated evil, the evil protected from its own consequences. The fragment that contains this description remains today in the shrine of the book within the holy city of Jerusalem. The complete Ges manuscript is safeguarded in Axum, Ethiopia, far from the reach of Rome's power. And the two fragments that would complete the entire picture remain, even today, withheld in a conservation process. The criterion that sends a person to the fourth cavity is not, in the end, their own personal and strictly private sin. It is the evil that that person kept alive in the world, allowing it to harm long after their own natural hour. That criterion remains engraved in Aramaic on a parchment older than any page of the entire New Testament. And it continues to wait, in silence, for someone to finally dare to ask why it was considered too dangerous. How many times does silence in the face of another's evil not signify neutrality, but exactly what Enoch places in darkness? And if the criterion of the fourth cavity is true, then the most dangerous question is not theological, but personal. The Book of Enoch was not buried for misrepresenting the dead, but for describing far too well those who buried it. If you want to discover what other truths were erased from Scripture before you could read them, subscribe right now.